Now, so we begin with Robert Schumann, but there are other men, particularly Konrad Adenauer. He was a German, and Alcide de Gasperi, he was actually an Italian. But these three men had several things in common. One was they were really devout Catholics, and that meant that they had also learned about Catholic social teaching. What did the gospel have to do with society, with the public square, with politics, and so on? And that was a teaching that the Catholic Church began to produce at the end of the 19th century, as Europe was really facing the Industrial Revolution, and all sorts of negative social results came out of the Industrial Revolution. And how do we get on with the social problem? These three men, Schumann, Adenauer, de Gasperi, they had all learned about how to start thinking about these problems from a biblical point of view, seeing every human being as being created in the image of God, and therefore having dignity. And this is the basis, actually, out of which all human rights have come in the first place. It needs that biblical perspective on human beings reflecting the image of God. And so they had that in common as well. And they were responding to the evils of the Second World War and said, we have to find a biblical basis for this. So they had common ground there. Now, the other thing that they had in common was that they all grew up on the borders of their nations, very close to the neighbors. Whereas when you have leaders who come from the center of the country, let's take France, Paris, Sorbonne, the university there. They were kind of the elite of the nation. They didn't care so much about the provinces. They were not so concerned about the neighbors. But each of these three men took the teachings of Jesus very seriously. Love your neighbor as yourself. And they said, well, this doesn't mean just the person who lives next door. This means the nation next door. That's our neighbor nation. What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? Now, that was a very different attitude, and it seemed to be unrealistic and naive to bring into politics, but they did. They dared to do that because they had seen that there had to be a whole other approach to politics than what had led to the Second World War. I've mentioned three fathers, but there were other people who were important too. Jean Monnet, who was a Frenchman, was another one. Now, he was nominal Catholic. He didn't have the same faith that the other three did. And then there was Jean-Henri Spaak from Belgium, who played a very key role as well. He was a socialist. So they had more of a nominal Christian background, but they didn't have the same motivation, but nevertheless played a very key role in the development of what eventually emerged. Each of these men recognized that something had to change in how people saw politics and how people saw the world, how people saw the future. And it's very relevant to what we're going through right now in Europe and in the world, because we hear a lot of people going back to nationalism. But Robert Schuman, for example, said, now this was the huge problem, to identify only with the people of your own nation and to say, let's make our nation great. This is what Hitler did in Germany, you see. And we have people saying it again today, don't we? We have both in Holland and in America. Let's make our nation great again. That's a huge problem. And this is why Schumann's message is so relevant for us today, because he was helping us to see a bigger picture. That we can't make our nation great by pushing our neighbors down. And that's what so often is happening with these kind of nationalistic people who are dividing them and us. And so this was the motivation of Robert Schuman. Now, it was he was actually the first French politician or first French parliamentarian to be arrested by the Gestapo when they took over Paris. And he was put in solitary confinement. Now, some years ago, I had lunch with a man, and he said, I saw the notes that Robert Schuman smuggled out of the prison to the underground, the French underground. And he said this: we French will have to learn to love and forgive the Germans to rebuild Europe after the war. Now, that's a very radical position to take. You imagine Ukrainians saying that right now about Russians, for example. And so, actually, he was accused of being a traitor because of that. And so he escaped, actually, from prison later on. And he spent the rest of the war preparing for the end of the war and thinking, how do we rebuild Europe after the war? And so he began to develop a vision for a future Europe, becoming a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. And that's why I call this book Deeply Rooted, the story about Robert Schuman. That doesn't mean that you expect everybody to become believers, but these values are really essential. So this was part of their motivation, and so we need to find another way that will stop us constantly fighting, particularly Germany and France. They constantly were, it was like alley cats, fighting each other. And they said, we've got to stop this constant cycle of fighting. And so the way to do that would be actually to bring the nations into a place of cooperation rather than competition. And that was to see a kind of a place of interdependence rather than independence. The nations being interdependent, working together, cooperating rather than competition all the time, not a them and us approach. Now, he wasn't trying to obliterate the nation state at all. He said they all have their own identities, and that's wonderful to celebrate. But we also recognize that we're part of a bigger family, and we can celebrate that. They saw that we had to learn from the lessons of history, which is something we're very bad at. We're repeating the same mistakes that were the Second World War right now. And they said we have to find a new way. And this was seeing that nations were just acting on the principle that might was right. And to our great horror, we hear this coming out of America again, just assuming because they're the strongest, they can do what they like and take over other nations. We never thought we'd ever hear that coming from America. And so the experience of the Second World War was to say, never again. We have to find a way to hold rogue nations accountable. Now, the way they did that was to recognize that when a nation goes to war, they need coal and steel to produce the weapons to go to war. So what if you tied these industries together in such a way that you made these industries accountable not to their own governments but to a neutral authority, a supranational authority, an authority above the nations. And that was the plan that this man, Jean Monnet, came up with as a way of finding, taking the competition out and bringing cooperation and mutual accountability. It meant interdependence. And so this was right at the heart of what eventually became the European Union vision, was to have the nations accountable and cooperating with each other in such a way that they would never go to war with each other. And actually that's been very successful for these 8 decades. It was the character and the trustworthiness of Schuman that made other people accept his plan that may not have been accepted if somebody else had presented it. Schuman was the one who was able to bring people together because of his character. And he was a very humble man. He never thrust himself into the front. Jean Monnet, I don't think would never have won the prize of the most humble man in Europe. But Schuman could have. In fact, the Catholic Church are in the process of recognizing his sainthood. You have to find some miracles to be able to eventually recognize somebody as a saint in the Catholic situation. But in all my reading about Robert Schuman, I have not found anything negative about his character. He really was a very saintly man. And even when he was Prime Minister, and at one stage he was Prime Minister for 7 months, and Minister of Finance and Minister of Foreign Affairs, he would go around turning all the lights out, and he would live a very simple life himself. and he would refuse to take the special car that was provided for him. He'd go on the bus, and he wanted to be with the ordinary people. So in that sense, his character was a very godly character, and because of that, people trusted him. So he had a very special role to play in the big plan, but it was teamwork. He needed to have Adenauer with him. Now, it was essential that a German and a Frenchman would actually take the initiative for this plan, because Germany and France were right at the heart geographically of Western Europe. They were the ones who were constantly fighting. They were the ones who created the circumstances for the World War, if you like. And their relationship had to be good and repaired for there to be a lasting peace in Europe. All right, let's talk about something that then happened on May the 9th, 1950. Robert Schuman was talking with the American Secretary of State who said, now you French have to come up with a plan. How are we going to handle the German problem? How do we bring Western Germany back into the fellowship of civilized states, shall we say? And we're going to have a meeting on May the 10th, and you need to come up with a plan for that. Now, he announced this plan in 3 minutes. And in those 3 minutes, Robert Schuman laid the foundation for the European House, in which today 450 million Europeans from 27 countries have been living together in peace. And then the next day, the newspapers all over Europe, were full of this plan that talked about the Schuman surprise or the Schuman bomb, and France surprises the nations. Because never before in history had the defeated country been treated as an equal. This was very, very new. And so here now Germany and France were being treated as equal partners, and any other nation could join. And so the European, the Schuman Declaration on May the 9th, I consider that to be the defining moment of post-war Europe. And it's a shame that it's not highlighted in our Dutch education. And we shouldn't just remain ignorant of it. We can go back to this declaration and find guidelines for where we need to go in the future. So that's why this was very significant, and eventually this was the first step towards then the European Economic Community coming into existence in 1957, which eventually led to the European Community and then the European Union. But you know how if you bring a magnet up under a paper with iron filings on, you bring the magnet up and they all line up. This is what happened on May the 9th. There was a plan that everybody could look at and say, well, yes, we should do that. And others would say, no, we should do this. And the whole progress has been kind of zigzagging all over the place, which is actually necessary because it's a democratic process. It's not owned by Schuman or anybody else. He put this on the table, and others had to then, we've had to evolve it. And the genius of this whole process is that we're allowing all the nations to be involved, and it's talking. Winston Churchill once said, jaw is better than war. Now, it's not perfect at all, and the reason why it's not perfect is that none of us are perfect people. So it's going to be, lots of mistakes being made and so on. But it's the best that we've got, and we need to really support it. And in the Netherlands, we need to be far more aware of the significance of what goes on in the European Union, representing us there, than we are. And it's very easy for populists to come along and blame Brussels for this and blame Brussels for that. And sometimes our leaders do that, our political leaders do that as well. It's easy to blame Brussels, but what is Brussels? Brussels is actually all of us European representatives combined talking together. And it's a very important process, and it started on May the 9th, 1950, with this plan that Robert Schuman laid on the table. That's why it's a story we all should know something about. Well, what I've been saying is that the EU is not a perfect place. And the EU is the result of all the people engaged in the argument of persuasion together, and that's far, far better than going to war with each other, which was the old way of fixing problems. And is what Putin and Trump want right now, using threats and wars and so on. But the EU way has been to talk and find ways to, and it's like the Polder model here in Holland, which has made Holland. You know, that we accept differences and we recognise that we've got to keep talking until we come to some kind of solution. There's never been any experiment politically in world history like this one. It's not an empire. It's not a super state. It's the smaller states working together, and it means that the small states have a voice. What both Putin and Trump are doing now, they're saying, no, we big nations, we're going to make the decisions about what happens to the small nations now. That's going back to the old 200 years ago idea of the concert of Europe, where the big nations got together and decided how things should be divided up. Now, one thing that's been forgotten that Schuman insisted on, and we don't like to talk about it these days, and that is this. He said, this project must not just be economic and technological. It needs a soul. Now, a few years ago, it's now about 30 years ago, Jacques Delors, who was the president of the European Commission at the time, and also was a believing Catholic, he was a socialist, believing Catholic like Schuman, and very much embraced Schumann's vision. He gathered religious leaders together and he said, I want you to help us find a soul for Europe. He says, if we can't find a soul for Europe in the next 10 years, the game will be over. So he saw the need for the spiritual foundations, the spiritual values to be at the core of this European project. And that's a big challenge for us today. And especially because, actually, when we look at the whole spectrum of Christianity, we have Catholics, Protestants, and let's say evangelicals. We won't even talk about Orthodox right now. It's not an accident that actually the impulse for the European Union came out of the Catholic area, because the word Catholic actually means universal. They have a bigger, broader picture. They see the bigger picture. After the Reformation, the churches became territorial. You had churches of the Church of England, Dutch Reformed Church, and so on. You had national churches. And so the Christians in those nations really just thought about their own nation. Now, it's important for us to begin to see the big picture as well and recognize where this is our shared responsibility. It's the future of Europe. And so finding that soul, being able to put these values back in the heart of the European project is a challenge for us all and for your generation as well. Thank you.